Burlington, Vermont was chartered in 1763 and settled in 1773. It has maintained status as largest city in the state, aided by the fact that it sits directly on Lake Champlain, once a major waterway used for commerce. Industrial development in Burlington centered near the waterfront and the railroad tracks that ran parallel to the shoreline. Within walking distance to these waterfront employers, the large corridor between Church Street, the city's main retail district, and the waterfront became residentially populated, including many small family businesses. In the 1950s, suburbanization and reduced railroad and lake trafficking threatened Burlington's economy. Other U.S. cities were experiencing similar problems, but on proportionately larger scales. Many began to institute downtown revitalization plans, including redevelopment of dilapidated areas. The federal government, in the Housing Act of 1954, offered financial assistance to municipalities engaged in redevelopment planning, giving birth to the term urban renewal. Theoretically, improved economic health in targeted areas would provide the federal government and the municipality with more tax revenue. However, prior to receiving federal funds, the designation of urban renewal project areas as slum and blighted was required. As more and more U.S. cities jumped on the urban renewal bandwagon, debates opened up in neighborhoods across the country. Residents of project areas defended the quality of their homes, while city governments, yearning for federal assistance eligibility, condemned them. The urban renewal chapter in Burlington's history book had begun.
The Champlain Street Urban Renewal Project started back in the late 50s in Burlington. The first city vote on it happened in 1958. Under Vermont statutes, the citizens of Burlington had to vote that slum and blight existed in the community. The city set up an area of 27 acres, which basically was involved with the land on the west side of Battery Street, then going up College Street, then turning north on Pine Street, up to St. Paul Street, and then back down Cherry, and then over to Pearl Street and back down to Battery. And I had friends and schoolmates that lived in the project area. My father had his medical office on Cherry Street in the project area. I knew and took care of real estate for the family in the project area and lived there while I was going to St. Michael's College. So I had a personal association, I think, with the area itself.
157 families and 67 individuals lived in the project area. More than 40 of the families had lived in the area for more than 5 years, and approximately 14 families had lived there more than 20 years.
Well, I was born on 12 Cherry Street, and it was a home that my dad built with some of his Italian friends. And I'll tell you, there was not a sturdier house on that street. It was very simple, very plain, but that house had 12 rooms in it. Of course, the 12 kids, why not, you know? And we enjoyed every minute living there. As a matter of fact, I lived there 51 years before I moved to North Avenue, where I've been 30 almost. Now, I don't care where I go today. We can start talking about where we live right now, but by the time the conversation is over, we're right back there on Cherry Street.
It was a two-story, an older house. My dad bought it back, I believe, in the early 50s, late 40s, early 50s. Lived there with my parents and my grandparents. My grandparents were also in the residence. My dad was city treasurer for the city of Burlington for 19 years. My mother was a policewoman, the second policewoman in the city of Burlington. And I'm presently the fire chief of the city of Burlington, and I've been in the fire service for the city for the past 30 years. So there's a history of city service, if you will, and quite proud of it and quite proud of the family that I came from.
I'm standing on the spot where my house would have been. It was 84 South Champlain Street, and it was in the back of 82 South Champlain Street, which my grandmother owned. 82 was a big Victorian-style 20-room house that had originally been a family home with my grandparents and my mother and all her sisters, but then it had been cut into 4 apartments. And that whole location was between College Street on the south and Bank Street on the north. Right now, the spot is the Chittenden Bank. I'm standing in the Chittenden Bank's parking lot.
Well, I lived at 81 South Champlain. It was between College and Bank. And I lived there from when I was born till I was 18 years old. And I remember growing up there as a kid, having a lot of good times and playing on the waterfront. I learned how to cut hair there from my father. Across the road from us, there was a bakery shop, Moquin's Bakery, and there was the Moquin family there, and they all worked in the bake shop.
Well, we lived at 86 South Champlain Street. I was about 7 or 8 when we moved there. My grandfather acquired the land. The house, it was a red brick house, and he acquired the house and the building next door, which he made a bakery out of, Mother Moquin's Bakery, where my mother and all her 4 brothers worked there. It was a family thing. That's the way it was in those days, you know.
The project area also consisted of 41 businesses. Some served as local gathering spots, blending seamlessly into the neighborhood landscape.
You had everything. You had the churches. You had grocery stores. You had a little private grocery stores, but it satisfied everything. You had the Corey grocery store, Merola's Market. You had everything right down. Eisel's just 2 blocks away. You had Reedy Funeral Parlor. Reedy did a lot of business back then, but it was close by. They didn't need a car to go every place. They had the hospital straight up the hill. Everything was there.
That was a strong neighborhood. Everybody knew everybody else. There was body shops, automotive people that work on cars. There was all these kinds of things in that neighborhood. There was a place on Battery Street called the Wagon Wheels. I don't remember how many people remember that bar. But as a teenager, we would go in there after dancing the country dances up in the countryside.
Then we hung around Merola's store all the time. We used to go there about every night. We'd all go up to the corner and we'd get ourselves a Coke, and we'd sit there and tell stories and talk about sports and trade baseball cards.
When we were having Italian food in my house, my mom would send me up for their cheese, and they'd hand grate the cheese in this little hand grater. He'd put a chunk in and grate it, and it was out of this world.
Back then, customers and friends were the same thing, and it was some meaning for a business to have this kind of relationship.
As word of a pending urban renewal project echoed through the city, the labeling of the designated area as a slum came as a shock to the people who lived there.
When I first heard that they were calling that area a slum, it probably took me back a little bit because quite frankly, I remember the Champlain Street area as not being a slum.
I think we were in a nice neighborhood with all hardworking people and businesses, and I never considered it a slum.
There was no way for the city to expand. Couldn't go east because of the row of churches and the residential area that was a pretty good residential area. So the only real choice they had was to look at this 27-acre parcel. There were 66 properties that were very bad, and the balance had some degree or other of problems that needed to be solved, whether it was having a 3-piece bathroom or internal heating or water in some instances.
But intermixed with that were some great, wonderful houses that were very well kept, some families that lived there for generations upon generations.
The good condition buildings were sprinkled throughout the whole area so that you couldn't say, okay, we're going to take this one block and rehabilitate it and do the number and the balance of it. And there was a critical mass issue for having enough developable area to allow the commercial expansion. So the project was not really one that lent itself for rehabilitation.
They had to say the things they had to say about that Cherry Street and that it was a slum area because they had to get this project through. Otherwise, they will never have gotten it through.
Burlington voters approved urban renewal in March of 1963, including a $790,000 bond measure that would be matched by $2.4 million federal dollars to assist with redevelopment.
You had 6 wards of the city of Burlington voting for it. The only one in Ward 5 didn't vote for it, but all the other wards, well, of course, it wasn't affecting these people. It wasn't affecting their pocketbook. There wasn't any increase in property tax. Why? Because the government was running it all.
The federal involvement was that if you cut down on slum and blight and its causes, the dollar that has to be spent in social services reduces. So from a long-term investment standpoint, there's some benefit. There's also benefit in decent sanitary housing.
The vote acted as notification to residents of the project area that they would eventually have to vacate their homes, and businesses would have to relocate or shut down.
My grandparents would have a habit of talking in French to each other when they didn't want us to understand what they were saying. And so that day that I walked in and they were in the kitchen talking French, I knew something was going on. And finally I asked, and they said it got passed. It looks like sometime down the road, we don't know when, we'll be all moving.
They wanted my father to go on North Burlington, and it was where they had a lot of apartments, and they wanted my father to buy that. And my father said, no, where am I going to put my trucks? He said, no, I'm just going to go without the business.
My father, he was quite upset. He was, at that time, probably in his late 40s, early 50s.
41,000. And the Riverside Public Housing Complex was constructed to house displaced urban renewal residents.
A person living in urban renewal, an elderly person, I'll give you an example. I was, sooner or later, it was all leveled and it was like a desert down there. You could see the Adirondacks right across the lake.
In July of 1966, 2 months after demolition began, 150 residents still lived in the project area.